Mañana de sábado, este día de sol, pues el amor por la teoría y el arte nos hace estar aquí en este auditorio negro y pues en este lindo día, pero así es la vida. En esta mañana me gustaría invitar al profesor Walter Grasskamp para la conferencia ahora de la mañana. Por favor, den la bienvenida al profesor Walter Grasskamp.
Both are working. Okay. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Is this okay? Dear Ivo, he's not listening. Dear Ivo, everybody thanked you from the speakers for being invited here. So do I. Not for the ritual, but because I think you made a great job in the selection of the colleagues. Most of them I didn't know, I was glad to get to know. And above all, in the selection of the artists who were speaking here. I rate art higher than art theory, I'm modest about that. So I especially enjoyed the artistic performances that we saw here. So thank you very much. And I want to like as well Patricia, Viviana, and Aimee for taking care of me, and all the others who made it a good symposium. Coming from a cool, if not cold, northern country, I always appreciate the southern friendliness that you supplied us with. The theme of today is the alchemy of culture, that is money. And the theme of my lecture is art and money, scenes from a mixed marriage. After many years of neglecting his duties, the careless Christian Joe Average decides to attend Sunday Mass once again. He manages to interest his wife in accompanying him, and a skillfully handled conversation over breakfast even wins his teenage children over. Is that okay? At last, it's too low. I'm giving my best. It must be the mics. It's okay? Good. At last, all set out for the parish church, which they all remembered as a dark building. But now it welcomes them with the glowing radiance of a newly cleaned sandstone, and the interior continues the surprise. Every wall has a fresh coat of white, all Baroque sculptures have been newly gilded, and the floor is immaculately laid out with white marble flagstones. Joe Average has to ask himself whether this is really the church he has not visited for such a long time. As the service begins, he is transported with delight. Celebrating the Mass is no longer that bowed veteran, dedicated to abstinence and looking every bit the part. No, a slim, sporty priest with long, dark curls put such a swing into the proceedings at the altar that the children turn off their Walkmans. Joe Average has barely time to cross himself before the man of God leaps to the pulpit, from where he delivers a sermon which holds all listeners spellbound. He thunders against the uncaringness of the rat race, turns sharply upon the dubious nature of possession from the aspect of certain death, and concludes with a shattering condemnation of consumer terrorism, peppered with a few ecological motives. After the sermon, the impressive interior resounds to the powerful roar of the organ and is gripped by the tones of a large choir, which, as Joe Average notes, not without an inner stirring, is entirely made up of young blonde ladies singing with the tongues of angels. Shortly before the final blessing, and just as our friend has the definite sensation of having reached the invisible bounds of paradise, the dynamic impresario at the altar comes to a sudden halt. Through the speakers, from which a velvety voice had announced the hymns to be sung together, now comes an announcement which stuns Joe Average. The soft voice thanks him and all the other participants for coming and assures them that it would be a pleasure to welcome them again. And then it informs that the speaker system was supplied by Sony Corporation. And for the organ, it is much obliged to the local Yamaha branch. The choir was sponsored by Vicks VaporUp. The wine was donated by a recommended restaurant in the neighborhood, and the renovation of the building has been made possible by a local estate agency. Completely disillusioned, Joe Average finally learns that the hip priest is a Mercedes-Benz itinerant preacher. This announcement concluded, the priest gives the final blessing, which Joe Average now badly is in need of. Too late had he realized why the stars on the ecclesiastic robe had appeared so familiar to him all the time. As it may be imagined, family lunch at the nearby restaurant is lively. The father displays symptoms of shock over such a scandalous case of sponsoring. The son, however, is very taken by the fact that the church at last has found its way to approaching the everyday life of its faithful. He too calls the Yamaha organ his own, be it a smaller one. And apart from this, he had always insisted that his father was losing contact with the real world. The sister contends that such promotion of consumer goods was hardly compatible with the contents of the sermon, which nevertheless had very much impressed her. Unwillingly, she must concede to her brother's argument, never having heard such a stirring call to repentance from a normal priest before. For her, this proves that top potential should be unconditionally promoted, albeit through sponsorship. With sponsorship taking over its upkeep and renovation, the church's finances would be free for much more important social concerns. These arguments fail to convince the father. He contends that the ecclesiastic mandate is basically incompatible with the worldly promotion of sponsors' trademarks. But the art historically versed mother reminds him of the medieval altarpieces showing the portraits of their donors. Smaller, of course, than the images of the holy and the blessed, but prominent enough, and later becoming the same size. She points out that Piero de' Medici in the 15th century had donated a marble tabernacle to a Florentine church on condition that the Medici arms appear on the Holy of the Holiest. Here she emphasizes the ultimate criterion of sponsorship was already fulfilled, the sighting of the logo in return for the money. But in those days, it wasn't for the purpose of commercial advertising, the father insists. And history apart, the church nowadays could afford to finance itself. As a manager of a bank, he knows very well just how rich the Vatican was, and that its dealings were not always done the way Jesus would have liked it. But the important thing, contradicts the daughter, is the gospel. It has to be delivered to the people, even if the evangelists themselves might fall short of its message. The ends justified the means. The father overrules these arguments as being too Jesuit. Yet he confesses that he was no longer sure himself whether the ecclesiastic mandate would ultimately be reconciled with money from sponsors or not. Anyway, he concludes, the pizza having just been served, the Mass had been worthwhile just for the family discussion, not having taken place to such an extent for a long time. But as he cuts his pizza, he examines involuntarily if the chilies formed a motif which might be interpreted as a trademark. Sunday afternoon, the father ponders over his desk, and the next morning at the ritual gathering of the bank's board ventures the question that it might be timely to follow the general trend towards sponsorship of religious rituals. The vexed circle at first demands clarification, But after a little more information, the proposal is met with great interest. The bank's marketing director confirms that switching to such platforms for advertising was unavoidable. Media specialists found out that the consumer hardly perceived conventional advertising anymore. Advertisements received only 2 seconds of attention as the reader scanned the pages of the advertising medium, the newspaper, and many a disgruntled consumer was completely ignoring the glossy double-page spreads. With television, the acceptance, as he puts it, of product information had rapidly gone downhill due to the invention of remote control. According to recent surveys, more than 50% of the viewers reach panic-stricken for the control unit when a commercial break interrupts the film. By contrast, the appearance of brand names in unexpected contexts achieved remarkable results, at the same time being fairly cost-effective. Only recently, some companies had succeeded in having sponsorship costs recognized for tax purposes as advertising expenses. And should this trend spread, he adds, rubbing his hands, media functional largesse would also be of interest on cost-technical grounds. Responding to questions, the advertising expert admits that the presentation of brand names outside normal advertising context was still delicate. Putting traditional fineness of feeling to account, he would therefore not advise cult sponsorship. Much resentment would have to be overcome, especially in Catholic areas. Instead of sponsorship of cults, he would extend the sponsorship of culture, sensitive of its milieu, to use his phrase. It too was still prone to the effects of prejudice. Unfortunately, one did not enjoy the liberal situation of the United States of America, where culture and economy shared the same bed. But the resistance of curators and artists was fading, and the public tended to a more liberal point of view. And so in conclusion, the bank's executive manager asked him to intensify his contacts with local and regional impresarios and curators to develop new possibilities of collaboration. The family discussion in the restaurant and the views of the marketing director present a collection of arguments concerning sponsorship in the arts common since the 1980s. And the analogy between art and religion is surprisingly appropriate. Even if one finds the idea of a Mercedes-Benz itinerant preacher far-fetched, I could mention that at Harvard, in the celebrated Busch-Reisinger Museum, an expert is working whom his business card declares as a Mercedes-Benz curator. This is Peter Nisbet, an informed man of our times, who once confessed his ironic hope that someday he might find himself cited in a work by Hans Haacke. The analogy of cult and culture has a historical legitimacy too, because economic taboos first arose in the context of religion. It was the medieval Catholic Church which made efforts to outlaw the desire for wealth and competition, the very impulses which were to form the basis of capitalism. Ora et labora, pray and work, the eldest monastic rule, prepared the way for the development of an uncommercial work ethic. It was based on the belief that everything not performed for God's pleasure was of the devil and must be reckoned amongst the 7 deadly sins. Amongst these were greed, envy, and insatiability, 3 economic motives notorious in today's commercial world. The contempt for the commercial in culture, still the norm today, owes more to religious traditions than many may be aware of, especially if they argue from a Marxist point of view. The religious rejection of commerce in culture still operates today, without much practical influence, but with great rhetorical prestige. Religious demotion of commerce is, however, not the only historical influence still active against capitalism. Aristocracy also set its standards by a distinguished disdain of bourgeois industriousness. The nobility of the 18th and the 19th centuries marked middle-class support for culture with contempt. In the bourgeois pettiness of calculation, The aristocracy, used to extravagance and lavishness, decried the stigma to bourgeois cultural funding. Finally, socialism was to form a third influential tradition to stigmatize bourgeois economy and culture. Until well into the modern period, the market economy was not recognized as an independent domain with its own rights and significance, but as deserving directions of external ethics. Even if the market economy finally has emerged from the shadows of religious, aristocratic, and socialist stigmatization, it is still denounced as soon as it touches the arts. So today, not only priests, princes, and party ideologists are advocates of the continuing stigmatization of market economy, art critique has taken over the economic taboos too. The Romanticism of the early 19th century propagated a religion of art under the German word of Kunstreligion, and in fact, affinities are evident to the present day between religious and artistic ideologies in literature, music, and art. Heroic attitudes of devotion and independence, even contempt for worldly goods and interests. At the center of this religion of art was the illusion of art as being something distant from, if not free from, the market. An indeed seductive fairy tale, but with only limited historic probability. Already by the early 19th century, art was published, sold, collected, resold, and auctioned at considerable profit on open and rapidly growing markets. This had little effects on aesthetics, however, because the art religious view persisted that saw the artist unmotivated by economic necessity and only working to fulfill a higher, ultimately inexplicable creative urge. This illusion, residing in an unrealistic denial of economic influence in art, may be termed the aesthetic syndrome that emerged and flourished in bourgeois society. Officially dreaming of a pure, autonomous art, bourgeois society commercialized art as a promising commodity. Art historians and critics, my colleagues, contributed in no small measure to suppressing the increasing commodity character of art. Only the materialist and Marxist representatives of art scholarship, mostly not teachers in the academic sphere like Walter Benjamin, Karl Einstein, or Arnold Hauser, indicated art's commercial context already at the beginning of the 20th century. But in any academic school of art history, at least on the continent, it was traditionally considered extremely poor taste to talk about art in terms of a market, except at most of the golden age of Dutch painting, the 17th century. Since the 1980s, a series of publications show that this attitude has changed. One should mention first maybe Svetlana Alper's famous book Rembrandt's Enterprise. One could mention Otto Karl Werkmeister's study with the wonderful title The Making of Paul Klee's Career, or the essay of the former Tate Gallery director Alan Bowness on the conditions of success, how the modern artist rises to fame, to name but a few. So it is no longer regarded as a Marxist idée fixe to discuss the correlation of art and economics, but it is indeed a new feature in academic research to place the formerly idealized, supposedly free artists in the context of their everyday dealings and wheelings. This point of view was fostered by historians too, by Peter Paré, for instance, and his great book on the early market of modern art in Imperial Germany that appeared in 1980, by Robin Lenman's excellent study of the art trade in Germany in the early 19th century, or by the late John Michael Montia's socio-economic studies on Vermeer and his Delft companions. It seems no coincidence to me that most of the trend-setting books were written by Anglo-Saxon historians, and not to forget Francis Haskell, art historians. It seems Anglo-Saxon historians could deal more freely with the economic aspects of art than most of their German colleagues did under the spell of the Romanticist art religion. The recent change of paradigm did not come out of the blue, of course. Art itself had changed before. Obviously, it took pop art to break the spell of art religion. The overtly affirmative self-marketing of the pop artists was the decisive step towards the end of the aesthetical syndrome. Andy Warhol's confessions of an entrepreneur made it possible to see Rembrandt as entrepreneur in retrospective. The sweet dream of an art free of the market could no longer be sustained even in the mass media. Aggressive art marketing, as reflected in records at auctions and in the numbers of visitors at art fairs, have long formed media success stories which deny the old illusion. Accepting that art in itself is, and for centuries was, a market functioning by rigid capitalist standards, we find ourselves as disillusioned as Joe Average in front of the Mercedes-Benz preacher. Although the commercial character of art is finally admitted since the 1980s, even in the academic sphere, this has not affected the discussion on sponsorship and corporate collecting. As long as art appears in its own shop window, this seems no longer to be a problem. But the problem remains if art appears in the shop windows of other markets, of banks, or of companies. Is this a compensation for the loss of the illusion of art being uncommercial? In any case, it is amazing how societies develop and maintain a desire for clean spaces in a moral sense, clean of economy or any other form of selfish interests. It seems that this desire grows parallel to the influence of economy. But the demand for clean areas beyond commerce lets people overlook that these areas have an economy of their own, that there always is a special economy in the seemingly uneconomic. Thus, selling things that seem uncommercial can be big business, as the art market proves. Given the demand for clean spaces beyond commerce, art still appears to be infiltrated, if not poisoned, by external influences from sponsors and corporate collectors. Sponsoring is, in fact, generally linked with the sponsor's interest to buy a public mention in the prestigious context of art, invading this field of autonomous science with his logo. But why should that arouse such a conflict? If the exhibition, the opera, or the book is not changed for more than for exposing the sponsor's logo at the entrance, on the curtain, or on the front page, it must be a very weak piece of art that should suffer from this coexistence. And what right have newspapers, for instance, to polemicize against art sponsorship from banks and companies when everybody knows that without the advertising from exactly the same sources, the newspaper itself would be much more expensive and practically unsaleable? And what credibility has the critic of sponsorship in a television magazine program when television itself is financed and secured by commercials, not to speak of television light entertainment financed by sponsors directly? Of course, the validity of moral criticism does not depend on the personal credibility of its advocate. But there are more arguments against the notorious criticism of sponsorship leveled by the media. The better newspapers and TV channels prove that it is possible to safeguard their editorial independence despite the massive reliance on commercial advertising in a state recommended as a balance of interests. If some of the mass media, of course not all of them, succeed in safeguarding their independence and making it their trademark in spite of their commercial links, one must wonder why, under the same circumstances, art should not be able to preserve its alleged autonomy. Is the rejection of sponsorship in the arts based on the fear that artists and their agents could prove more naive or corruptible than editors or political journalists? Or is it a preventive measure engendered by the fear that art's autonomy might all be down to a lack of opportunity to betray it? Is art a much more sensitive substance than a newspaper report in which truth is at stake? In contrast to advertisement, a telenovela, or the news, art is in fact expected to be multi-layered in its contents and intentions, therefore open to interpretation and responsive to different ways of perception. But this might have become a sentimental notion. A high percentage of contemporary art is obviously made to fit into any context of presentation, be it a public exhibition or a sponsor's lobby, a private apartment or a corporate collection, an art fair or a collector's private museum, a gallery, or any company's flagship store. A growing number of artists have no problems playing the game with any partner in the field and to serve their interests. A huge part of contemporary art seems only to have been made as fashionable social backdrop. So, what is left to be defended on moral grounds against sponsorship? For the longest time of its existence, art was a decoration of power. But modern art broke this alliance in proclaiming its autonomy. But has the dogma really changed very much in practice? Do we have to revise this dogma? Or should artists and art mediators be more aware of their role in capitalist societies? I'm afraid most of them are aware and eager to take their share. If ever there was something incorruptible in art that cannot get lost on its way through the market and that has to be protected, I'm afraid we might be running out of good examples. But even if there is a lot of art that is compatible with any sponsor's or corporate collector's interests, we cannot be sure that it is worse than the art that criticizes contemporary society. Our estimation of art is rarely influenced by the political and ideological circumstances of its production. Otherwise, we would not admire Caravaggio, and we would not admire Bernini, for instance, playing very dubious roles in the Catholic regain of power during the Baroque era, in the heyday of the not-so-holy Inquisition. So we cannot be sure if today's most opportunistic art will not be admired in future for qualities unseen by us. Social decoration, of course, is not the only service that art traditionally offers to its political and commercial partners. It also allows nobilitation. That is the very reason why it is just the sponsors who, as parasites of this old-fashioned myth, tend to support the uneconomic legend of art and emphasize its transcendent character to profit from this moral appeal. In this, they meet with many artists who act as entrepreneurs but talk like priests of art religion, many of them without interest in noticing this contradiction at all. If these artists are instrumentalized by sponsors, it is not the sponsors alone to be criticized. The point is that the uncommercial aura of art is indeed of a great commercial value, not only on its own market, but in the field of the media too. And as the greater public still believes in art's uncommerciality, art is an ideal camouflage of commercial motives. It is of course more problematic if the sponsors are not only looking for decoration and nobilitation, but for diversion, especially when companies who have to confront critique for their business practice invest in art to distract attention. This is probably not as frequent as suspected, but more current than agreeable. This is the field of tension between art and its business friends that the artist Hans Haacke has spent the last decades examining. It's not necessary to describe Haacke's work in detail. He was last year's guest of this conference. So let me just quote an early piece of Haacke's dedicated to the choice phrases that came from the lips of New York executives, including this gem from Exxon manager Robert Kingsley, conspicuous by its candor. I quote, "Exxon's support of the art serves the art as a social lubricant. And if business is to continue in big cities, it needs a more lubricated environment. End of quote. In a famous case of such lubrication, the painter Walter Dahn complained in the 1980s that the leading German bank, the powerful Deutsche Bank, had only bought and exposed his paintings and the works of many other colleagues to distract attention from the bank's alliance with the then still racist regime in South Africa. So he declared in an open letter he would never sell any painting to the Deutsche Bank anymore if it continued this business relation with racists. That is a honorable attitude, but at the same time it nourishes some doubts. To name but two, do artists overestimate their influence or presence in corporate collections if they think art could be a suitable means to camouflage disgusting business connections? And do managers, on the other hand, overrate art if they want to instrumentalize it as a decorative wall around their more undecorative business plans? Is sponsoring in the arts thus a result of mutual overestimation? Harke once quoted a French executive manager who claimed that supporting the arts would allow the company to act tough in other issues, probably negotiations with workers' unions or questions of ecology. In this case, of course, sponsoring the arts would really pay for itself. But I doubt if this spokesman was right. Art may function as camouflage, but can it seriously be expected or suspected to serve as a buffer in political conflicts? My friend Hans Harke, of course, works always with the worst examples, and they are not that difficult to find. But I wonder if the worst cases of sponsoring are indeed the typical ones. The urgency with which sponsorship has been discussed over the past decades reflects the fear of an economy that hollows out all other values, termite fashion from inside. Economy is credited with corrupting all other spheres of society and subjecting them to its interests, and the sponsor embodies these vested interests with which he adulterates art like an economic virus. But on the other hand, there is still a lot of naivete in this field, so the repetition of the truth, as Bert Brecht once said, might be as important as the truth itself. Take an example that allows me to quote an artist at least as admirable as Hans Harke is, namely the Brazilian football legend Pelé. When a guest at the World Championship of Football in Germany, where his team lost as well as mine lost, although Ivo, I appreciated your good wishes for my team, didn't help. When a guest at the World Championship of Football in Germany, Pelé was asked what he thought had changed in football since the time when he was an active player. His answer was, I quote, "Everything that happens outside the field." In short, marketing, sponsoring, most of all technology, communication, and the media, without which a championship was impossible to be marketed worldwide at my time, and therefore was not interesting for commerce and advertisement. But, so Pelé ends, in the field itself, not so much has changed at all. End of quote. Pelé's views are plausible insofar as no sponsoring has yet changed the rules of football concerning, for instance, throw-in or offside. They are taboo to any sponsor. That's good. These rules do not only exist on paper, but they are surveyed by referees on the field. But is it really true that the growing investments in sponsorship and advertisement around the field of football and the worldwide attention and distribution of the media should not have influenced the game itself? It is hard to think so, because, as Brian Eno once put it, attention creates value. This value manifests today in increasing and incredible sums of money that are paid to and for the players, and it manifests in the sharpness of competition in the field and the more brutal way the rules are interpreted in body language. Unfortunately, this World Championship gave a lot of bad examples. Above all, it nourished severe cases of corruption, only to speak of Germany and Italy, in which referees of all were the protagonists. So Pelé is too optimistic. Even football, or football above all, shows effects of alteration and severe commercialization and is no longer an innocent folklore. It's even worse with art, because in contrast to football, art has no fixed rules. They have been abolished not only by the artists themselves, to mention Marcel Duchamp only, but by the increasing importance dealers, collectors, and the art market in general gained during the 20th century, to mention the Saatchi collection only. A game without any explicit rules is, of course, much more vulnerable to outside influence as football ever will be. One of the most prominent arguments is that sponsorship is promoting good things with money from dirty sources. Money for the arts is welcome only from particularly pure sources, that is, public money. This is astonishing if one looks at the issue historically. Cultural finance has always been a highly dubious affair, particularly in those epochs which were regarded as golden ages in art history. Culture, not to quote Walter Benjamin exactly, was always evidence of the barbarism which secured its finance, frequently from the murkiest sources. Take the enlightened Landgrave of Hesse, for example, who commissioned the Museum Florentianum in Kassel as the first art museum to be built for the public. This Landgrave replenished the state coffers by renting his own subjects to the British Army as cannon fodder for the colonial campaign in North America. So, when you visit next Documenta, you enter a wonderful palace of art built with veritable blood money. And this is only one example. Only in modern democracies have the financial guarantees by the state lost their notoriously dubious nature. But this is a slight illusion too, for after all, the state is only redistributing funds it has acquired through taxes. Taxes from the profits of environmental pollution, exploitation, and the wastage of natural resources, from weapon industries and stock market dealing. In a commercial society, nothing exists in its pure state, and so even public money cannot be regarded as pure or clean in respect to its origin. Its distribution by the state is a kind of moral money laundering. And apart from that, history shows that state funding of culture has always manifested political interests too. The great advantage, of course, in public funding is that it can be expected to be neutral and transparent in its pursuit of the general good, having no individual power to bias funds in any particular direction. Therefore, it is generally executed by institutions responsible to the public and advised by independent experts like we are. It seems that moral criticism of sponsorship was only made possible by the democratic cultural policy, which has economically and politically neutralized cultural funding by acting along legal methods and by blurring the origin of the money received through taxes. But one of the most unwelcome effects of sponsoring is that it gives politicians every reason to refuse public money for funding art museums or cultural events. Applicants are told to get their money from sponsors even if they have no chance and everybody knows it. So, new models of non-commercial cultural funding have to be found and to be discussed. One is to establish public foundations, which is high fashion in Germany at the moment. And a good one, because foundations are legally defined and controlled and can only work with the interests of the capital they invest. Advised by competent boards of experts, public foundations seem to be the best way to combine private money with legal control, democratic procedures, and valuable aims. Foundations have advantages for everybody concerned, for the state, who has to confirm them, because they support and take some load off him in the finance of culture, for the donor, because it gives him the possibility to see his money, even if it was earned a dubious way, spent on good causes. Good aims may neutralize bad origins. For any applicant, because he or she can expect fair chances depending on the quality of his or her project. Of course, also this recipe is not infallible and incorruptible, but who and what is? In Germany, there have been severe causes of misuse of foundations in the past, one of them by the Bavarian minister-president. So control has been increased. In comparison to all the other current models, this one arises the least moral problems and dangers of misuse given a competent legal control. And after all, foundations can deliver high standards for the practice of sponsorship, which is not bad in any case, as I tried to point out, but has to be discussed in concrete detail. Some partners match, others don't. In any case, to come to an end, there is no infallible recipe to deal with the matter, but probably one: think liberal, act responsible. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ivo, is there time for questions, or should I leave the desk? Time for questions. Please, if you ask the questions in Spanish, give the interpreters a fair chance to translate it so I can understand it. Some ear performance. I think there's the microphone over there.
Here.
Just a moment.
I can put the question in English. First, I would like to congratulate you because it's like the first conference I hear where you come up also with a proposition of the model of these public foundations in Germany, which I, by the way, find to be very interesting. And secondly, I would like to address two specific issues. One, the importance of the corporate role in the actual art market, and secondly, the enrollment also of the corporate figure. So on the first hand, I have been analyzing the enrollment of the corporate figure in the last few years or generations. And I have came to very concrete results in which I can see a decrease in the participation of the corporate figure in the art market since the arrival of the social responsibility model, in which big companies are starting to rechannelize the money, actually, their funding, into social projects more than arts. So there is for sure still a collecting trend in the corporate world, but I think it's always decreasing. There's only a few serious corporate collections left that actually maintained their endeavor in this art scene, because they also are acting not only in the market trend, but also are involved in the whole art scene, and that's only a few. So when we talk about corporate, I think it's sometimes just a big illusion that we create in the whole arena of the art field, because the involvement is actually pretty much decreasing. Then the second one would be the engagement of corporate roles, which I think those corporations that I mentioned that are still involved are actually also pretty actively engaged in this whole proactive trend. And what does that mean? It means that they issue a lot of prizes and awards that are very significant when we talk about the CV of an artist. But on the other side, who is the board of these awards? And it's in part constituted by these board members that actually don't have any idea of the art world, art practice, and art theory. So that's just a little opinion and question in that direction.
I accompanied the development of the art market for 25 years, since the first market for the first fair, art fair for contemporary art was established in Cologne in 1967. From then on, this was my art sociological field to work in. But, and I did for years, but I must confess I'm fed up with the theme, so I can't give any information that are younger than 10 years old. Art market is no longer my theme, but what you say is right, and it has to be, and it can be made. I have a good example for it that made me think about what corporate collectors are really doing. The great Harald Seemann, which every curator admires as the first and best curator of the 20th century, who died 2 years ago, was advising a big German insurance company to build a collection. And this collection is, for three reasons, interesting. It was the first time that I saw a manager accompanying Seemann wherever he went. So they bought together, never seen before. Buying art in a company is a task for the middle level, not for the top level. So I met Seemann on several art fairs, accompanied by this manager, who was in fact the boss of the company, and a company with thousands of persons working for it. So I thought, this man is really engaged. He has a passion for art. This is the first example of a corporate collection that has a handwriting. And you could see them arguing like an old couple. Do we buy this or don't? And so on. It was wonderful. It was, and I am a romanticist, so I'm seductible by idols. Is it idols? I prefer idealistic views of the world. So I thought, this is wonderful. So what happened? When Seemann died, the chief of the company decided to have a catalogue published on this collection, which in fact is the only collection Harald Seemann left, working on exhibitions all his life, but not leaving a museum collection having his handwriting. So this corporate collection is the only Harry Seemann collection. At the same moment, the insurance company was bought by an Italian company, and everything changed. And one of the first things that changed was that this catalogue was cancelled. I knew because I was the one who should have made it. And they cancelled the celebration they wanted to make to the second day commemorating the death of Harald Seemann was cancelled also. So the new management stopped everything that worked in this direction. Harald Seemann even installed the collection in the corporate's building. I mean, there are many photos from him with hammer and nails, but most of them are true. He really chose the places, he hung the pictures, so it was a hard thing for both of them. So one of the next things that happened was that this chief, this boss of this insurance company, lost his job. Because he was very important, he didn't lose his job, he had to take another task within the corporation's network. So, but he was kind of, lost his rank, and he didn't have the power to do anything about the collection anymore. And that made me think, that made me think. And what I thought was, my impression was, that this man had afflicted with an unwritten law of his like, that managers buy art but don't care about art, that they're not allowed to show any passion for art, which he did. So he presented a weak side of himself to his colleagues in this very macho field of competition and power. And I thought, okay, if he collected art for passion, what do the others collect art for? And my thesis is, my most recent thesis about this is that managers and corporate collectors, if they are involved in choosing the pieces of art, buy it to get immune. It's a kind of homeopathic practice, because as soon as they would take art serious, they would have to think about what they are doing every day. I mean, this is still an alternative model of life, romanticized, as we know, when we have to do with artists, but it is still envied for very many issues. The life that the artist leads is still envied for many, many issues, and some of them are right. I don't envy the artists, for most of them have a severe alcohol problem. As I know, teaching at an academy as art historian, and they have a lot of other problems that seem to be connected with this profession in a way I don't understand. But other things are wonderful. You stand up in the morning and you decide what you do on your day. I mean, this is complete freedom. So if a manager buys art, he must be very aware that he's buying a commodity that is a testimony of a life that he himself does not lead. Rich as he is, there is something left in life that he doesn't have. And he buys this art to immune himself, to build a wall between him and the artist, and not because he loves art. As soon as, and this manager did, as soon as you love art in this high rank of business world, you are a weak person. So this is my impression of what is happening in corporate collections. Most of them are bad. Most of them are bad, because it needs a handwriting, it needs a passion, it needs a person, maybe a couple. As soon as there is a board, forget it.
Walter, can I ask a question? First, I thought it was a remarkable presentation. Thank you very much. Things are put very, very clearly, and the contradictions, really, that you're describing are somewhat demoralizing, to paraphrase on some level. But I wonder if there's an example I want to bring up, which I'm not sure you've done research in. I assume you have. It's BMW. And a particular corporate protagonist over the past decade or so in the BMW Auto Corporation, Günter Lorenz.
I have problems understanding what you said. I don't know why. Pronounce more loud. Pronounce it more loud.
I'm just wondering if you have done research into BMW.
Okay.
There's a protagonist there. I know this because I was involved in the process of a corporate commission in the late 90s with BMW. There was one of the chairman of at that time was Günter Lorenz, who had a great passion for art, and was involved, at least in the instance of the project that I was involved with, called Autowerk, that was eventually shown at the Deichtorhallen, in which a number of often very interesting photographic artists were commissioned, right, to produce works. They did a research process for almost 2 years in which they were invited to various BMW plants all over the world. They could develop their projects, and they did in fact produce work that was commissioned by BMW, some of which ended up in their collection. Other works, because of editions, ended up in, obviously in the marketplace. So I wonder, based upon that particular example, involving obviously a protagonist in this, Günter Lorenz, the former chairman, who was committed to art, apparently, eventually left his corporate position, and after that point, in fact, in some way BMW stopped commissioning art. But what about that model? Is that, again, sort of a kind of neo-romanticism of there's this one sort of individual who is there not only collecting, but in fact attempting to in some way maybe immunize the company on some level, but also find another model of sponsorship which involves commissioning, in which artists are invited to research and to somehow make comment upon. I mean, is this, I mean, obviously this involves the same contradictions, but what do you think about that model?
Yeah, you're right. Günter Lorenz is a good counterexample to the story I was telling before, because he was a manager who was able to defend himself. He was exotic, not less than the other one I was talking about, exotic in his milieu. Ardent art lovers in this management level are exotics. If they can defend themselves, they're okay, and Günter Lorenz could. The other one couldn't. And they are regarded as exotic. It's left kind of, they develop a kind of tolerance. Well, this guy is collecting weapons, this is his hobby, this guy is collecting old cars, let him collect art. That pays off most of decoration, that's for sure. But as soon as this person leaves the job, it is disputed, it's newly discussed. And of course he was disputed because he's a real extravagant figure, a flamboyant figure, although he appears in the lifestyle a manager has to do. BMW is a very good example because they do something that has been done before in Germany and I think on the continent by Volkswagen, VW. That is to establish this kind of meeting point where the client, it's not the client, where the customer comes and buys the car, and to build a kind of park around the act of taking the car. This is, there are more examples in the United States, but it was new to Germany that a company as big as Volkswagen built a huge park in Wolfsburg where the cars are produced with a function that the customer comes by the train. Therefore, they changed the train line, and they could change the train line to Wolfsburg together with the government, and gets his car in a ceremony. They established a theme park. That's the word. They established a theme park around the ceremony of handing the car over to the customer. There's a big hotel, and there is an exhibition worth visiting with pavilions dedicated to the cars they have. There's one for Lamborghini, there's one for the normal Golf, there's one for every sort of car they have. And of course there's art. And the entrance building, a huge entrance building, has been let's say decorated with the works of 4 artists. 2 of them you never would have expected to decorate a theme park where a commercial act is celebrated. And nobody knew if this would function. I was involved very early in this case because the city had to do something in contrast to this huge project. There's a small city, there's a huge company, and they were thinking about doing something with art in the public sphere. So very early I knew these plans, and I didn't believe it could work. I was rather naive about it, and it works like hell. It is the leading, that's a word I learned in this process, it's the leading one-day destination in Germany, even if you don't buy a car, just to go to the temple where cars are handed over. And one of the artists, I'm afraid he's my colleague, but I can speak frankly about it anyway, one of the most rigid artists in terms of autonomy, Gerhard Merz, made a work for this temple. So, I mean, if this happens, what else can we expect? As soon as BMW saw that this worked, they said, we do this on our own in Munich. And this is the change in art policy in the house. This is much more important to have this, they call it Autostadt, which is a car city. They call it car city, although nobody lives there. It's not a city. It's like a pilgrimage center. Like in India, Deepak, you know this wonderful town on the top of a hill that can only be visited by day and is completely empty in the night and is a complete city in its own. This Autostadt, this car city, is a city like a pilgrimage center, and as soon as it was visible, there were thousands of people going to this temple of handing cars over. BMW decided we do this on our own in Munich. And it's not yet ready, but I'm sure they will much more concentrate on events like opera, concert, maybe some lectures by poets, than they will on art. BMW is a good example because they really brought artists to the edge of autonomy, giving them cars to paint on, like David Hockney did, like Penck did, like Roy Lichtenstein did. I mean, this was horrible. This was completely horrible. I have one of them. I don't know what to do with it. It's like small. One car is painted by an artist, and then an addition of small cars, model cars, are made this way. I'm glad I never see them running through the streets. No one of them succeeded. That's interesting. No artist succeeded in making a good painting on a good car. I mean, it's good cars. We have to say it's. Maybe this is unsolvable for modern art also to make a good painting on a good car. This was done by Günter Lawrence as well. Günter Lawrence,
the first one, yeah.
Yeah, Günter Lawrence has much more prestige from what he buys for his own than what he did for the company, I would say, to give it a polemic point. And I once had to open an exhibition of a Japanese artist who was commissioned to make films on BMW because they already did with VW, with Volkswagen. They had the best directors for film that made films on like creating myths around a car. I mean, it's romantic. What is the word that Max Weber used to characterize what happened with Enlightenment? It's the I forgot it. It's like the Entzauberung der Welt. It's in German. It's like taking like taking the witchcraft out of the world that you perceive as working in it, and it's changing the world. Pardon? Exorcist? No, it's a wonderful word. Entzauberung der Welt. It's like discharming or something like that.
Disenchanted?
Disenchantment. Thank you very much. Disenchantment. It's a wonderful word. And his thesis is what happens with modernism is the disenchantment of the world. And this is re-enchanting the world around the commodities. And artists are standing ready to deal with it. Even Gerhard Merz, of all people. Ingo Arendt, a very good German video artist, who did a lot on globalization when nobody was talking about it, is in this temple of handing cars over.
But can I just ask, I'm sorry, I will give the mic over just in 1 minute. Two somewhat unrelated questions. One, as you argue persuasively in your paper, art has always been semi-autonomous, which I believe is a useful term still. So if art has always been semi-autonomous, even in the case of Gerhard Merz, it remains semi-autonomous. So maybe the more things change, the more they remain the same, just as an observation. Another point, in terms of foundations, have you done research into, for example, the creation of a foundation called Creative Capital in the United States, which is a creative capital, which is an outgrowth of the Warhol Foundation in New York, in which artists are, in order to get support from Creative Capital, which is a private foundation, which also has certain public funds as well as private funds, and they have to propose an art project that will have some kind of sustainable commercial viability in the world. Now, most artists who apply for this don't really understand what that means because the guidelines in the end are blurry and amorphous. But I don't know if you've done research into this particular new model in which, okay, it's an interesting, in terms of the evolution of foundation.
Sounds like, yeah, sounds like.
Okay.
Yes, want to make a tiny question about I think you have a great job about the relationship between money and art, and I do understand your proposal about foundations. But first of all, our tiny comment, as you say, nothing is perfect, everything is easy to corrupt. And particularly in Mexico, we have awful tradition about foundations, because pretty often they're run by the family who owns the foundation, of the owner or the corporation, etc., or even the government. And pretty often, as the other people did say, they are not current about the interests of the artists, and they even intervene in a pretty nasty way on the development of the art. But my question goes more into not the influence of economics on the art, but the influence of art on economics. Because lately, it has become not only a commodity or a merchandise, but even an investment. Pretty often, the financial advisors recommend you, when there is deflation or inflation, why not better, instead of buying this kind of a stock market, you just invest on art? What is your opinion about it?
It's difficult for me to understand. I don't know, I'm out of the focus of the acoustic. Could you just repeat one sentence with a question?
Yes. Well, my interest is more, what is your opinion of the other side of the relationship? How it is art affecting to economics?
The other side of the relationship from the side of the artist? Or from the side of the sponsor?
Well, both. But because I think artists pretty often, as you did say, I did love the sentence you used, they act like priests, but they act like promoters, even if they talk like priests.
Yeah.
But actually, I think it is part of the new relationship that some artists do realize that they are affecting, like even some of the examples that you just mentioned about BMW, etc. But even the merchandise themselves, they are becoming part of not only the art market, but economics themselves. Yeah. Even some countries, they have not only funds, some dollars or the euros, they have collections, etc., as part of their economics funds.
Teaching at an art academy, you have to decide